Hi, I'm Manville Smith. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about our CleanSweep product line and how it can help you achieve excellent results when needing to do an OEM integration in a vehicle. Before talking about what the product does and how it does it, I want to explain a couple of fundamental terms that are important in order to kind of figure out what it's doing for you when you apply it in a system. The first thing we need to talk about is frequency response and what it means and why it matters to what we're doing in OEM integration. Most of you have probably seen a piece of equipment like this right here, which is called a real-time analyzer or a spectrum analyzer. The purpose of an RTA is to visually represent the relative energy of audio in different frequencies that are audible to our human hearing system. On a typical RTA like this one, the lowest frequencies we can hear are at the very far left, and the highest frequencies we can hear are at the very far right. And this particular one has 30 bands of resolution, as most do that we work with in car audio. So when we see a flat line in response, like we're seeing on this display at the moment, what it's telling us is that assuming the signal that's feeding it is flat, meaning the signal has equal content in all frequencies, that the response of that signal remains flat through all the electronics that we're putting it through. If this curve were to vary from there, that is referred to as a frequency response deviation, and that can be achieved electrically using equalization, for example, or different kinds of filters. Now, when we use an aftermarket head unit, which we're all really accustomed to using, we always start with a flat frequency response. When we set the bass and treble flat on that head unit, the signal we're getting out of that head unit when we apply our test material to it is a perfectly flat response. From there, we do things in the system to season the response to what we want to hear in the car. We may lift the bass a little bit, brighten up the tweeters, maybe with a passive crossover, maybe with a tone control. But we always want to start with a flat frequency response. That is the purpose of a source unit, really, to provide that flat starting point. If we have any variation in that, it will affect the way our speakers sound in the car. Many of you are accustomed to seeing RTAs used in auto sound competitions, sometimes just as an SPL meter or sometimes used to judge what they refer to as RTA in sound quality competitions. When used for that purpose, what they're actually wanting to measure is the acoustic response of the system. And you'll see a microphone plugged into the RTA in those applications. That is not what we're measuring here. What we're using here is the line level input of the RTA. So all we're looking at is the frequency content of the electrical signal coming out of the source unit. We're not interested in the acoustic response of the car. The acoustic response is going to vary from this depending on your speakers and locations and your gains and your EQ settings after the fact, etc. So we're really just looking at the starting frequency response of the signal that we're working with in the system. That's the purpose of this tool used in this application. We're not interested in the microphone. The microphone stays in the bag and is not used. There are a number of good RTAs on the market. This is one that we like a lot. It's not the least expensive out there, but it's very rugged and very good. You can also get software-based solutions that you can use on your PC if you have a PC. But as we'll discover as we go through this training, you'll see that this tool is incredibly important, and really every installation shop that is serious about OEM integration needs to have this tool in the shop. What I'd like to explain now is this little test setup we have here. We have a radio from a 2002 Volkswagen, and we have our real-time analyzer, which we already discussed, and the CleanSweep DSP processor. I've taken the CleanSweep calibration disc and put it in the head unit and put track 1 on, which is a multi-tone that contains equal energy at third octave centers. So at each one of the bands that the RTA displays, there's equal energy in the track that's on this CD. So a perfect radio would output a straight line like we used earlier to describe the function of the RTA. Let's take a look at what this Volkswagen radio actually does with this response. I have the DSP processor defeated to show you the natural response of the radio. Signals going from this radio into the DSP unit and then right out into the RTA. So the output of the CleanSweep is connected directly into the input of the RTA. What we see here is a pretty typical OEM frequency response curve. Instead of that nice flat line, which is our target, what we see is that there is a significant decrease in energy below about 40 hertz. They do this typically to protect factory speaker systems from damage when the user gets a little too aggressive with the volume control. So by rolling that energy off, they actually limit excursion. Then there's a big notch in the mid-range, probably designed to conceal some peaky behavior in the mid-range speakers that are used in the car. And then a broad rise in the treble range, again designed to conceal a flaw probably in the frequency response of the factory speakers. That probably compensates for a lack of high frequency extension in the factory speakers. If we were to apply a perfect loudspeaker system and drive it with this signal, okay, we would be listening to a very uneven frequency response represented by the RTA here. The factory systems apply this equalization almost always now. It's become very cost effective to employ a small DSP processor inside these head units, and they have some free horsepower left over to apply these kind of corrections. So they take advantage of that, and because they want to give their customer a better listening experience with the limited resources they have in terms of the speaker quality they use and the locations that they choose and all that good stuff. The problem is when we put in a really nice pair of speakers in the car and a nice subwoofer, we're dealing with a curve that fundamentally starts from a bad place. And if we don't do something to address that and to correct it, then we're essentially limited in what we can do. What we want is this flat response that you see right here. And the flat response you see is the fact that the CleanSweep processor has just gone out of its defeat mode, and as you can see now, its correction is active. In case you don't believe me that this thing just happened on its own, what we'll do is we'll do a complete calibration to show you how you can calibrate a CleanSweep when it's installed in the vehicle. We connect the 4-channel outputs of this head unit, which is simply a high-powered head unit in this application, to the 4 high-level inputs on the CleanSweep. We insert the calibration disc. We turn the volume of the head unit up to approximately 3/4 level, anywhere from 2/3 to 3/4 level. It's not critical exactly where you are in that range. You just want to choose an arbitrary point. You don't want to go all the way up because we want to make sure this radio is not clipping. And you don't want to go too low on the OEM volume because then we might not have enough signal to get a clean result on the other end. The more signal we have going into the CleanSweep, the better our result is going to be. Okay, so we've established our 3/4 volume level at this point. And in order to calibrate the CleanSweep, you use a precision tool like this bent paper clip I have here, and you press the calibrate button. The lights will start to change in color and do some things for a few seconds. What's happening here is the first thing the CleanSweep is doing is analyzing the level of the signal coming out of this radio, because the signal could be really low level or it could be really high level. CleanSweep automatically detects the level of the signal and sets its input sensitivity automatically. And then, once that sensitivity is set, it converts that analog signal into digital audio with 24-bit resolution. At that point, the CleanSweep analyzes the frequency response in the digital domain and applies 30 bands of equalization per channel in order to correct that frequency response. And as you can see, while I was talking, the unit went through its whole cycle in about 22 seconds. And the result is 4 green lights, which means you've achieved a successful calibration, and you can see the result on the screen right here. This is the CleanSweep's master volume control here. As we can see, we also have a signal that remains linear when we adjust volume, which is very important for good aftermarket results. Whenever you're dealing with a head unit that has full range outputs, the implementation is very straightforward and very simple, like in this case with this Volkswagen head unit. This unit simply spits out 4 equalized full range signals. It's important to note also that the signals coming out of this radio are different in the front and in the rear. I'll give you an example. I'm going to defeat the DSP unit so we can once again look at the frequency response. This happens to be a front channel output on this head unit. I'm going to change the connection to the analyzer to one of the rear channels. And as you can see, the curve is completely different, actually more aggressively equalized in the rear channels. So one of the nice things about this DSP unit is that it's able to analyze each channel independently and correct it independently back to flat. That way you have a nice flat front and rear signal. So whenever you have full range signals that are equalized, the CleanSweep's ability to correct that is absolutely vital if you want to create a good sounding aftermarket system using the OEM head unit. Okay, now that you've achieved a successful calibration and you have a nice flat frequency response, you can still operate the head unit's tone controls and they will behave appropriately. Here's a nice treble boost. This one has a mid-range control, so we can apply a mid-range cut, for example, and you can see that that totally works just fine. Or a bass boost, a little bit high for our taste, but nevertheless the tone controls are fully functional. Another question that a lot of people have is, okay, you've set it at 3/4 volume, so you can't touch that volume control or the whole thing blows up or smoke comes out or it loses its mind or it freaks out. It's not true. In fact, if the customer prefers to operate the system with the factory volume control, that can certainly be done. You can simply bury the control somewhere in the installation or disconnect it entirely if you prefer, and the customer can operate the system using the factory volume control. What the customer might notice, and may or may not be okay depending on how it's implemented in the system, is that the frequency response can change somewhat at lower volumes because some of these factory systems apply a volume dependent correction effect, and that's usually a bass boost at lower volumes and maybe a slight treble boost. It's really not the end of the world. So if the customer wants to use his steering wheel controls and doesn't want the knob installed, that should never stop you from doing a CleanSweep installation. The only thing you can't do, absolutely, if you don't install the knob is use the aux input on the CleanSweep for an additional source. You'd have to interface any aux sources through the factory head unit at that point because this becomes your only volume control in the system. So it certainly isn't it shouldn't be a deal killer ever if the knob isn't desired in the installation for one reason or another, although it is the cleanest way to do it and gives you the absolute flattest frequency response. It's certainly not the only way to use a CleanSweep. Okay, we're going to look at an application here with a radio out of a Lincoln, and this radio and audio system in this car is actually very common in most of the Ford premium systems. Let's say we didn't know much about it when we started, and we simply grabbed the 4 head unit outputs that come out of this radio because they were easy to find and obvious front and rear speakers. We plug them into the front and rear inputs of our CleanSweep DSP processor, and we attempt a calibration. In this case, I'm not going to turn on the RTA right now, assuming we didn't have an RTA in the car at the moment. So let's try to calibrate this thing and see what happens. Remember that the CleanSweep needs a full range input in order to calibrate. It needs to have the full band of frequencies from 20 Hertz to 20 kilohertz represented within a range of about plus or minus 15 dB in order to be able to do its job. If any frequency is higher or lower than that plus or minus 15 dB range, it will have a difficult time achieving a flat result. The CleanSweep will tell you when it has a problem, and it uses a different series of flashing lights to indicate this problem. As you can see right here, this is exactly what an installer doesn't want to see when he applies a CleanSweep into a system. Usually this happens on a Saturday afternoon and you're trying to get out of there and you get the wrong color lights coming out of the thing, and your first temptation is to grab the thing and throw it across the parking lot as far as you can. But it just requires an extra step in order to achieve a good result. And the CleanSweep is actually telling you why it is having a problem. You'll notice that the front channel indicators are alternating between red and green. So how do you interpret that? Well, we were smart enough to put the codes right next to the lights, so don't ever call us and ask us what the lights mean. They're written right next to them. Here we have an alternating red and green, so here we see red, green alternating, EQ active, partial correction. What that code means is that the CleanSweep was not able to achieve a satisfactory flat response, but it tried its best. Okay? And on the other set of channels in the rears, we see just rapidly flashing red lights. And again, if we look at our codes here, it says calibration failed because the input signal is not full range. CleanSweep is telling you that the signal applied to it was not correctable for two different reasons in each of its channel banks. Let's turn the RTA on and see what happened here. Okay, we are looking at the output of the rear channels at the moment. Let's turn up the sensitivity a little bit. This is the one that's telling you that the input signal was not full range. As you can see, there's some stuff missing down here at the bottom, and this is after CleanSweep attempted to correct. It was not able to do a good job. Let's see what the CleanSweep started with on this signal, what it had to work with, and you'll see why there was a problem. Oh my goodness. Okay, we have a very severe high-pass filter applied at a fairly high frequency in this system, right around 250 or 300 hertz or so. So all of the information below that frequency is missing from the signal, and the CleanSweep, needing a full range signal, was not able to rescue a corrected response from this input. Okay, once again, I'll show you what the CleanSweep tried to do with it, but the result is not a satisfactory full range flat corrected response. Okay, now let's look at the front channels. In the front channels we had a different code which told us that partial correction had been achieved. This is the signal we started with. It was still a high-pass signal, meaning that there's a bunch of low-frequency information missing and it has some EQ in it. Let's see what the CleanSweep was able to rescue from that mess. As you can see, the CleanSweep was able to get all the dots on the screen, but it is not a flat response correction. So that's exactly what the code means, that partial correction was achieved, but it wasn't a completely successful calibration. Okay, so what do we do in this situation? Obviously, we have a problem with the signal that's feeding the CleanSweep not being full range. There's something we haven't found in this system that is necessary in order to complete the full audio range. And what we haven't found is the fact that this head unit, as with many Ford premium systems, has a separate dedicated subwoofer output coming out of it. So by not grabbing that low frequency information that's on that subwoofer output and adding it to these front and rear signals, we're not able to achieve full range. So the next step we have to take is to apply a summing interface to do this. In order to achieve a successful calibration with the CleanSweep DSP unit, we have to input full range. And when we're dealing with a situation where the input signal is crossed over, as it is in these cases, we have to find where that other information is in the factory system and add it to this signal before putting it into the CleanSweep. Now in this particular case, this Lincoln radio, as with most Ford premium systems, has a dedicated subwoofer output coming out of it. We need to take that subwoofer signal and actually add it to this front signal and also add it to the rear signal so that we have full range and the CleanSweep can do its job and flatten that response. There are several ways to do summing of signals. Probably the crudest way to do it is with line output converters, which we commonly refer to as LOCs. LOCs are passive devices that use little transformers, and they're inherently lossy by design, and they degrade frequency response further. And they have a very weak ability to level match signals that are of a different level. They can be used in a pinch in many situations, but it's really not the cleanest approach. Another way to do it is with an active preamp that has the ability to sum its outputs because the inputs and outputs are isolated. Those products can work very well. JL Audio sells a product called the CleanSweep CL-SSI, which is dedicated and designed purely as a signal summing interface. And because it's so targeted at what it does, it has a few features in it that make it really well suited for this application and make it really easy to set up for the installer in a minimum amount of time. And that's really critical, especially on that Saturday afternoon where we're trying to get out of there and we need to get this car done. Okay, we'll pull our CL-SSI up front here, and we're going to plug the sub signal coming out of the radio into the subwoofer input, the rear signal into the rear input, rear high-pass input, and the front signal into the front high-pass input. We're going to put our calibration CD into the OEM head unit. We're going to turn the volume of the OEM head unit to approximately 3/4 volume, just as if we were calibrating the CleanSweep from scratch. And then we're going to need to set the input levels on each of these bands so that we have a good, even summing result. And this is how this is done without the need for any external tools. This is the real killer feature of this product, is its ability to tell you the relative level of signals. Now I've turned all these potentiometers all the way down. I've got my 3 inputs plugged in. I've set the range switches on speaker level. There's a range switch on each input that's either speaker or line level. We'll start with the speaker level position on each one. And now what we're going to do is use a flat blade screwdriver to trim each one of these potentiometers until we get a green light. If we go too far, it'll show us a red light, so we just back it off a little bit. And we have green there. Back that off a hair, get back to green. And then the sub input. Okay, Houston, we have a problem. I turned it all the way up and it's still telling me it's too low. The unit's essentially telling you at that point that isn't a speaker level signal, and you need to go over here and flip this switch over to line level. Okay, so even without really knowing that that was a line level input or line level output out of the radio, the unit will tell you. Okay, now we've got a red light. That's too high. So we'll trim that back down. Hopefully get green happening here. Beautiful. Now we have 3 green lights, and 3 green lights is always a good thing. From that point, you simply take your precision CleanSweep calibration tool and recalibrate the DSP unit. And hopefully, instead of those red lights and red and green alternating lights, we'll get 4 nice green lights when we're done with that process, and that means we've achieved a good correction result that we can use to build our aftermarket system with. Isn't it great when a plan comes together? 4 green lights means we've achieved successful calibration. We did all of this really without even turning on the RTA. The SSI was able to tell us the relative levels of the signals we were summing, and then this unit is telling you that it has achieved a successful calibration. But I always like to check things to make sure that everything's right. So we'll turn the RTA back on to see what we've actually achieved. And as you can see, we have a very nice flat frequency response to work with, and we're monitoring the front channel at the moment. I'll defeat the CleanSweep momentarily to show you what it started with, which is essentially the result of the summed signal between the sub and the front channel through the SSI. Now we'll go and look at the rear channel results, and we can see that we've achieved a substantially flat result on the rear channels as well. Show you what we started with there. That was remember that had a very high pass frequency. It was actually staggered, but the CleanSweep was actually able to fill in that range and get it corrected relatively flat. So we started with a front high pass that was equalized, a rear high pass that was equalized, a sub signal that was equalized. We summed them together through the SSI, applied them into the DSP unit, and we're able to get very usable flat signals to use for our aftermarket system. And it was all done very quickly and very simply. The whole process of calibrating the SSI and calibrating the DSP should take no more than a couple of minutes once you've got all the connections made. When you're playing a music CD, it's completely normal for these lights to dance around and go red or yellow or green and dance around in between. That's because the level of the music is constantly changing. The only time that the colors have any meaning is when you're calibrating the unit with the CleanSweep calibration tone. Okay, so if you see red lights flashing, it doesn't mean anything's clipping, nothing bad is happening. That is completely normal operation of the unit once it's done. The CL-SSI is capable of operating in 2 different summing modes. In the 2-way mode, which is selectable via a switch on this panel of the unit, it will sum the sub signal to a rear high pass and a front high pass signal. So in a lot of OEM systems that are set up that way, that's the mode you'll probably use most of the time. Some cars, however, have 3-way crossover setups where they have maybe a sub, a mid-range speaker, and a tweeter with individual channels driving those in the OEM system. If that's what you're facing, you need to flip that switch from two-way over to three-way, and then the unit will sum the low pass signal to the band pass signal to the high pass signal down to 2 channels and output 2 channels of audio. It'll output those 2 channels out of its front and rear output, so it'll feed all 4 channels of input on the DSP processor. In some really exotic situations, you may actually have a 3-way front and a 3-way rear in a car. In that case, you would need 2 SSIs to sum each front and rear section, and then you would need to take the output of the second one and splice it in to the harness that's feeding the DSP unit, so you have a distinct front and rear signal in the system with full fading capability. So if that happens to be important to the customer in that application, you can achieve that even when you have 2 3-way setups by simply using 2 of the units.